Thanks everybody for joining. I know we have 50 people registered for tonight, which is kind of mind-blowing, that 50 people want to talk about regional chestnut production and processing in the Northeast region, and very excited to have you all. Looks like we're up to about 20. As I said, a few people have joined since I said it. We are recording this call and it will be shared beyond who's on this call. So anything you say or do on this call will be seen by others. Um, and yeah, we also try and run these calls as in a pretty informal way. Feel free to, I think probably the easiest way to do it, because everyone's muted by default, just to make it a little more organized, is where it says react at the bottom of your screen. I believe you can raise your hand. So if you click on that heart, you should be able to raise your hand and we'll see that in the chat, and then we can call on folks and have a discussion. Really feel free to chime in at any point throughout this call if something we say isn't clear or if you want to go a little deeper. The way we're going to kind of do this is we'll do a higher level or more broad overview today, and then we're going to do a follow-up call in about 2 weeks where we expect to go into a bit more detail about some of the facilities that we visited in Italy, some of the specific equipment that we're leaning towards or away from for our use case, and kind of a review of some of the manufacturing companies that we visited, just to get into a little more detail. Tonight, again, it's going to be a little more like big lessons learned and takeaways from the trip. But as much as it's helpful, feel free to ask some detailed questions and we'll just let you know if we're going to get into that next time or if that's a topic for tonight's call. All right. So just before we get into the trip, this is all building on the organic market development grant that Breadtree received. We received it about 4 months late last March, and we got straight to work. This grant is in total about $2.8 million. About $800,000 of that is Breadtree's match, and then the remaining balance is cash to be reimbursed upon expense by the U.S. government. As many of you probably know, right now, that sort of funding is totally up in the air. At this point, we have no guarantee that we will be paid for anything that we've done under this program after January 19th. So that was about 2 months ago now. So we are hosting this call tonight, not actually knowing that anything we're talking about will proceed under this grant, but kind of continuing to do the work that we can do in a way that is not putting too much burden on our business right now. So we really believe in the spirit of the grant application, which was to do this for the region, to learn how to build a facility and what equipment to source on behalf of our region, and to do it so that it works for any farmer who's interested in participating in the Northeast region and to more broadly influence national chestnut production and processing. So we'll continue to share everything that we've learned in this first year of the program, regardless of the status of this grant moving forward. But as of right now, we've basically received no guarantee that we will be reimbursed for any expenses we incur past January 19th. Just to summarize what this project includes, it includes technical support for current and aspiring chestnut farmers. Many of you on this call have already signed up for one-on-one calls with me, where we've talked through any number of questions that you have about chestnut production or that you're encountering in your production already. We've also already taken on the start of a feasibility study looking at other chestnut production regions in the world and what we can learn from them and how that influences our facility's specific design. And at some point, right now, we're targeting a May release of a rough draft of that study that's really looking at our decision process for deciding what equipment we wanted to source for our specific facility. And then Bug and Noah on our team are leading up culinary development and outreach, which is engaging mostly restaurants, but also some bakers and food companies in conversations around how they can integrate chestnuts into their business, and even maybe some opportunities for recipe sharing or public events where we can help people to encounter chestnuts in different prepared in different ways. And then ultimately, the reason for the project is to convert these barns you see here into what would be the largest chestnut processing facility in the country, which would be a certified organic processing facility. And the budget of this grant does not cover that full project, but it will get us going in a pretty significant way, assuming the funding comes back online. And if anyone has questions about kind of what we're doing in terms of communicating or advocating on behalf of this project, I'm happy to follow up by email, or you can either me or Bug can answer your questions on kind of where we stand on the grant and what we're doing. It's russell@breadtreefarms.com or bug@breadtreefarms.com. So we wanted to start by just giving a little production context for this facility. As many of you are farmers like us, your heads are probably often down, and it's a little hard sometimes to keep track of just what's happening across the whole region. So to the best of our ability, we've been mapping out regional production to actually have a sense of how many chestnuts might flow through this facility someday. And from what we understand of regional chestnut production systems, these are some examples of the fields that we're managing, which are coming into production, which we started selling to our customers last year, grown on Brad and Elizabeth's land. Thank you, Brad and Elizabeth. And what we've mapped is our land under management, including some of the contracts that we have to be planting out this spring and next spring for other landowners, is about 300 acres that is either planted today or will be planted by the end of 2026. Beyond that, it seems like there's somewhere between 400 and 600 additional acres across our region. And that's not including Pennsylvania as of right now, so New England and New York, that either are planted or will be planted over the next 2 years. So roughly speaking, we're moving towards 1,000-acre production region here in the Northeast over the next 10 years. I would expect we will have 800 acres planted in our region by the end of 2027, based on all available information. At this time, if you don't think, or if you think there's any chance that we don't know how many trees you've planted or plan to plant, it would actually be really helpful if you could share in the chat where you're farming or where you're aspiring to be farming, and either how many trees you are managing on that land, or how many acres you're managing, and how many trees you plan to plant, or how many acres you plan to be managing. So broadly speaking, by the end of 2027, how many trees or acres will you be managing in chestnut production? And why this is really important, as shown with this yellow highlight in here, is as far as we know, in the US today, I know of one facility that maybe peaks out at about 200,000 pounds of processing in Michigan, and another facility in Ohio that in a peak year is doing about 100,000 pounds a year. So while we have a lot to learn domestically, and we have talked to folks in Michigan, Noah and Bug did an extensive visit with Amy and Greg and Bob Staley out in Ohio, and we've learned a lot from them. We really are kind of taking on a different scale of project than, as far as we're aware, anything has been done for chestnuts in the US, where we're saying by 2035, 10 years from today, as much as 1 million pounds might need to be flowing through our facility, depending on what other farmers decide to do in terms of their processing and go-to-market strategy. So it's potentially as much as 10 times bigger than any facility that's currently operating in the US. And then also importantly, what we're targeting with this facility is quite a bit more diverse and complex in processing flows than what's currently operating in the US. I did see a bunch of chats. Is there anything, Bug or Noah, that I need to respond to? Oh, I see Elodie's asking about the boundary where we are estimating. So Elodie, this right now is New England and New York. Technically speaking, the way the USDA classifies our in region is 400 miles, which I don't really think is all that practical of a region for us to serve. from a processing standpoint. That would include most of Pennsylvania, I believe. Um, Bug, Noah's just messaging that he can't see the chat when he's screen sharing. So if you see anything in the chat that needs responding to, please chime in.
I'll do it. I'm paying attention. I'm just eating
Thanks.
something.
Elodie, did that answer your question?
I think
Yeah,
it's
so
also
it doesn't include Pennsylvania. It's just New England and New York.
Yeah. Though, if
Okay.
you know producers in Pennsylvania who want to share about their production, I've talked to a handful of folks who have been interested to learn from this project. So it's not that we don't want to talk to people from Pennsylvania. It's just not what we've been expecting will be acreage that's flowing into this facility.
I think one really valuable, like relevant observation on this topic from the research that we've done in Europe is just that it's very common in regions with more mature and well-developed chestnut industries for processors to aggregate from like pretty massive geographies. You know, we were in a facility in Piemonte called Fratelli Castellino that is one of the largest. It's, I think, the largest processor in Piemonte, which is the largest production region of many pretty productive regions in Italy. And they were aggregating from all over Italy, France, Spain, Algeria, Turkey. Like you know, there are facilities that process tens of millions of pounds, and 95% of it is imported from other countries, which obviously in European terms is has a different implication than it does here, but like from geographies that are analogous more to like the entire East Coast, which is not necessarily like a goal of ours, but it's just important to understand that from a logistics perspective and from an operational perspective, like that's totally possible. And that's a reason why we need to see this planning like in many ways as possibly conservative.
Yeah, I think I'd also add in two piece of information about this regional production. One is that this curve has gotten a lot steeper in the past 5 years than it was when Bread Tree started in 2019. Um, I mean, I think a handful of folks on this call were managing chestnut trees maybe before 2019, and a lot of trees have been planted since then. So uh, I wouldn't expect that curve. I would expect there to be much more acreage in 5 years than what we're mapping here. This is just assuming we all stop it in 2027. Um, that said, I think some of the recent funding announcements and pauses probably will impact some of the near-term plantings. All right, Noah, should we
Russell,
look
can
at
I
the?
ask a question?
Oh yeah, go ahead,
Quick
John.
question. Did you are you all aiming to the processing facility you're setting up is to hit these targets in the regional yield, the blue line is that kind of what you're aiming for?
Yeah, it's a helpful question. I think really what we're kind of finding, and this I'd say this is still up for debate in terms of what relationships we make with fabricators, is to some extent the equipment we would buy to be like a 700,000 pound facility isn't all that different from the equipment we would buy to be a 1.2 million pound facility. It's really like the jump from knowing that we're stopping at 100,000 pounds to knowing it's going to be somewhere over 500,000 pounds that I think is ultimately going to determine the scale of equipment that we're working with. It's the difference between doing like a couple thousand pounds a day and doing 20 or 30,000 pounds a day of moving through your processing facility in harvest and processing season. Um, so so I guess to say like I think we'll design this facility hoping that if we get to a place where it's at 1.5 million, we can serve that. And the other thing we've been saying is like over purchasing, basically buying the equipment that really the facility won't need until 2035 or 2040 is probably the wrong investment today. Because if the problem is we're all producing way more chestnuts than we accounted for and the facility is saturated in terms of throughput, it's going to be much easier and more affordable for us to finance a larger facility as a region in 10 years based on those results than it is for us to do so today way ahead of time. So there's some way in which like even if we believed 10 million pounds will be flowing out of the Northeast, in 2040, it wouldn't really make sense for us to build a 10 million pound facility. Does that make sense, Jono?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks. That's good to hear a little bit about your thinking and kind of what your trajectory. It makes a lot of sense to kind of scale it up over time, just because there'll be a lot of learning along the way.
Yeah, we're kind of in this constant squeeze of like, okay, this funding is nice to have, and also we're taking on a level of project that our organization is not quite set up to be handling. So, trying to make the best use of these federal dollars while we have them for the region, but also trying to be responsible in terms of what we can manage. All right, Noah, do you mind jumping to the next slide? So, an important distinction that we've also found in having some of the conversations we've had, both domestically and internationally, is actually that when you say Chestnut processing facility, that can mean 50 different things. So, for example, in Michigan State, they are moving about 200,000 pounds a year, or they feel like that's the throughput they can manage, is what we've been told. But they also have never processed through a hot water bath for weevils because it hasn't been an issue for them. So for those folks on the call who don't know, we have both we have native weevils that are endemic across the eastern US, definitely within New York State. This is an insect that lays its eggs within the chestnut. The eggs hatch as the chestnuts are ripening, and a worm actually eventually will crawl, a larva will crawl out of the nut. So did you want to say goodnight? Hi. I love you. I'm talking about worms. Worms. Um, so for us in the Northeast, unless we are going to spray, and there are some conventional treatments, but unless we're going to spray conventional treatments, we should all be expecting that there will be some incidence of weevils in our nuts after harvest. And one of the ways to treat for that is to subject chestnuts to, it's up for debate, but an approximately 20-minute bath at 120 degrees. And that hot water bath actually kills the eggs before they hatch, preventing larvae from crawling out of the nuts and leaving a tunnel. So the reason I use that specific example, and then we'll kind of zoom back out to this whole flow schematic, is that a 200,000 pound facility that is not doing a hot water bath is very different than a 200,000 pound facility that is subjecting every nut that comes through its doors to a hot water bath. It adds a lot of complexity in terms of the moisture you're introducing to those nuts and kind of the delay within your processing cycle of having this 20-minute duration that's working in batches. So our ambition with this facility is we will receive chestnuts, ideally largely separated from the burrs, the spiky burrs that are around chestnuts, though ultimately that will be somewhat dependent on harvesting methodology. We will talk a little bit about different harvesting methodologies later in this presentation. We would then move the chestnuts, burrs, leaves, sticks, rocks through an air-based and aspiration separator. So you put the nuts with all of their potpourri of things through this aspirator. Everything else blows out. Then the rocks drop out because they're higher density, and you keep the nuts moving through that aspirator into your sizer or calibrator. A calibrator, in most circumstances that we're looking at, is going to be basically a large cylinder with different size holes in it. And as the chestnuts move through that cylinder, they drop out where in the hole that is calibrated to their size. So it's a way of separating out extra large nuts, from medium nuts, from small nuts. Then once the nuts are in totes that have been sized, we will intend to send the nuts through a hot water bath or a sterilization chamber. A sterilization chamber is a bit different than the current kind of like domestic status quo, which is dunking nuts into a bath and holding them there for 20 minutes. A sterilization chamber is actually a giant auger. It's a stainless steel metal cylinder with 120-degree water in it, and an auger that is continuously moving nuts through that cylinder at a rate that allows those nuts to be submerged for the intended duration. This is what the Italians have switched to after kind of using the dunk-based system years ago. It's also way more expensive, but way more efficient. From that, there's then this kind of ambient or open air curing process where the nuts are drying and coming back to room temperature. And then they're being graded, which is occurring either through optical sensing, so a computer reading the quality of the nuts, or through humans reading the quality of the nuts, looking for discoloration, holes, cracks in the shell, often on a conveyor system, and then moving into fresh nut bagging, cold storage where they're kept moist so they don't mold or dry out, and then ultimately fulfillment. Additionally, in this facility, our ambition is to have a drying, shelling, grading, where we're grading the dried kernels. So again, looking for discoloration or mold or other defects, and then ultimately milling those chestnuts probably into a variety of products. So both probably a fine flour product, a coarse flour product that's more like a cornmeal, but we're also interested in products such as chestnut flakes, which is more like an oatmeal-sized kernel, or a product that comes out of France called brise, which is more like a rice kernel-sized fragment of chestnut. And then all those different dried products will be bagged and also stored in cold storage until they're going to fulfillment or for a delivery. So as far as we know, none of the facilities that are moving 100,000 pounds even today in the US are doing all of those steps. They are doing a lot of those steps, but not all of them. And so what we're trying to take on a more complex facility than exists in the US, but also about a 5 to 10 times larger facility. And so that all is a long way of saying it's why we felt like we needed to go overseas and learn from folks who are working at a much larger scale than even we intend. A number of the facilities we visited in Italy were between 10 and 20 million pound a year facilities. So really not a size facility that we intend to ever achieve, but there was a lot of learning that we could garner from those visits. And so the last thing I'll say, and then I'll pass it over to you, Noah, is just specifically why did we choose Italy? As you can see from this flow diagram, we really see the dried product line as an important part of the future of US chestnut production. For one, depending on how you're culling and doing grading, as much as 20% of your product is not going to be suitable for fresh chestnuts. So being able to create a high value product, even just out of that 10 to 20% of culls, as we move to be a 1 million pound regional industry, is a pretty substantial product line to be able to serve. And then also what we saw is Italy is really the most advanced in terms of dried products in the world. It's also the second largest exporting country. And so there was a lot to learn from Italy having a 500-year-old mature chestnut production industry, but also having dried products, also being the second largest exporter in comparison to China, but with a bit more focus on the processing lines that we were interested in, whereas the Chinese, a lot of their processed items are more like boiled nuts or peeled but still wet and roasted nuts that then are bagged in vacuum sealed bags, which is not a product line that's all that interesting to our business. We'd prefer to be selling either just fresh nuts as a produce item or dried products that are a bit more shelf stable and a bit more diverse in their culinary uses. And so being on a friendly budget, but a somewhat constrained budget, we elected to go to Italy as the place that we felt like we could get the most out of the most relevant experience, and also experience visiting processing facilities as well as the manufacturers who make the equipment for those facilities, which is a bit of an Italian specific offering, given that the Italians actually export a lot of their equipment to other chestnut regions. Noah, did I capture everything that I was supposed to share?
I think so.
All right.
Um, all right, so I'm gonna go through a couple of uh, high level takeaways, kind of like themes that emerge from our impressions from this trip. Um, And then we will go into some more kind of technical specifics, which will progress in the second session into more, as Russell said, more like company by company specifics of what different processors are doing and what different equipment manufacturers are offering and so forth. Um, so one big takeaway that we came away with, which was not exclusive to what we observed in Italy, but just was informed by what we observed in Italy, was um, continuing to see chestnut flower as a really important market development opportunity for growing the footprint of chestnuts in the Northeast and more broadly in the US. Um, and it was interesting, like uh, a lot of the chestnut people who were deep in the chestnut industry in Italy saw that as a little bit crazy because it doesn't work quite as well in their economic context. Like in Italy, there's hundreds of millions of chestnut trees in the forest. There's a very ancient uh, like agricultural production industry of chestnuts and um, much more of like commodity economics at play where, people are making I can't remember what, but like I think maybe retail was like 5 euro, €5 a pound, maybe like €8 a pound tops at two. You said two, Russell?
Yeah, yeah, it was like €2 a kilo, so a
Two
dollar a
euro a
pound.
kilo. So that's like $1 a pound.
$1 a pound, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so lower than I even remember. So that's like very, very different than, Route 9 Cooperative, like selling out at 9.50 or $10 a pound conventional. It's like order of magnitude different. And one implication of that in terms of flour is that, as many of you probably know, when you're making flour, you're losing like between a half and two-thirds of the weight of the nuts because the nuts have a lot of water in them. Which means, if you're selling, like we sell organic fresh chestnuts today for $12 a pound, uh, basically it like to the equivalent cost if you were thinking about it in terms of opportunity cost, would be like we would have to be selling flour for $36 a pound, or depending on the conversion, between 24 and $36 a pound, which is like a very high price that I don't think we would feel good about selling flour for, and makes it like totally not a staple food at all. Um, but basically, like we can, in the States, we can maybe sell flour for I don't know, $8 to $15 a pound, and the economics still work. Whereas in Europe, like though that would be impossible. And I think it's just an important note in terms of like understanding that the chestnut industry here is really nascent, and what that one thing that affords us is a lot of latitude to be intentional as a community of practitioners about exactly what way do we want it to grow. Um, so like the gluten-free market is enormous and growing quickly. It's an area where lots of food buyers are already accustomed to trying new flours. And like at least in our personal experience, this is a way more versatile and easy way to eat chestnuts every day. If that's the actual point of all this, then fresh chestnuts, which are also great. Um, big takeaway number two, which is a little hard for us to convey here because we don't have great photos of it, but we just wanted to try to convey this. Like, there's a lot of places we saw where, like, agriculturally and ecologically, they're like left a lot to be desired, but there were definitely some really amazing examples of like true landscape scale diverse perennial agroforestry. And if you look closely at this image, this is in Viterbo, which is like in the mountains east of Rome. If you look closely, you will see that like the majority of this landscape is perennial tree and shrub crops of different types. Like these are in the most impressive cases, these are really like pretty diverse mosaics of olive and hazelnut and walnut and chestnut and grapevines, sheep on pasture, honeybees, managed woodlands where there's like a lot of mushroom foraging and some mushroom cultivation. So this is like, you know, I don't think that this is like the most aspirational agroforestry in the whole world, but it's definitely like in terms of like a diverse mosaic of like each patch of the quilt is in itself pretty simple, perennial staple crop, but altogether it creates a really impressively resilient landscape that I think help make it feel a lot more real. These are a couple of photos from this region where, we're standing above a huge ancient chestnut orchard looking across it. I think this is probably olives right behind this house. And it's like if you just squinted and didn't pay close attention, you would think this is just a forested hillside, but like actually this whole thing is like what J. Russell Smith writes about. Um, it's just another image. You can just see these ancient chestnuts in the foreground and a whole kind of mixed uh, uh, tree crops on the other side of the valley. Um, Another like really incredibly inspiring thing that we got to see here was just like the the presence of these really ancient chestnut orchards and the uh, intergenerational relationships of stewardship that have been present for many centuries between families and these groves of chestnuts. Um, so, I think this chestnut here that Nathaniel's looking up at was over 400 years old. This is at Marco and Hector Bozzolo's about I think it's about 40 acres up in Piemonte, which is kind of like just over the mountains from the northwest coast. Um, we got to visit some of the traditional smokehouses where uh, peasants and mountain people in these regions have been basically harvesting chestnuts from both the forest and from cultivated orchards and from like this whole very fluid gradient of, between like truly wild stands and very current cultivated agriculture and like old orchards that were cultivated and now are a little more wild and like there's a whole, like spectrum that they have a lot of different words for. That's more than just a binary of like forest and farms, but they've been harvesting chestnuts, smoking them in these two-story stone huts. And in Pistoia, which is the little region where these photos were taken, they've traditionally ground those kernels to flour. In a lot of other regions, they would store them as dry, they would winnow off the shell and store them as dry whole grains and rehydrate them in milk and wine as like a daily stew. And people have literally been living off this for centuries in these areas. Um, so just in terms of like bringing to earth a lot of these ideas that are, I think strongly held by probably a lot of people on this call, but it's still different to really see it. Um, it's pretty powerful. This tree was grafted before Christopher Columbus was born and, has been feeding people every year for whatever, 600 years. Um, and I think this tree on the right is estimated to be 700 plus or minus 300 years. Um, so it's like it just gives you a sense of like some of what I think the intentions that all of us hold in terms of like this work as ancestor work is really real. And we got to visit with some of the descendants of those ancestors who made this landscape possible. Um, we definitely came away with some caution. There has been a lot of like really beautiful symbiotic land stewardship in these regions. There has also been a lot of degradation and I think a lot of like too much of a good thing kind of thinking, like the same kind of thinking that's gotten us to 90 million acres of GMO corn in the United States. Like, on the right, you can see an example of these old chestnut woods that we got to visit with this family. Um, and, you know, on one level, it's like very it's structurally diverse in the sense that we get to see, like I said, that whole gradient of like truly wild chestnut forests that have then been like ruthlessly eliminated every single thing that isn't a chestnut. And then there are places where there are like you can tell that it used to be an orchard that then got coppiced 100 years later and then regrew and all this stuff. But basically, it's like whole mountains that are completely terraformed to just chestnut and they're burning the understory every year continuously. And, they made the most diverse forests in New England, or like the most, what we think of as the most degraded forests in New England seem really diverse by comparison. So we share this just to say, like, there is a lot that's inspiring and a lot that's informative about kind of the traditions of land stewardship that we saw in Italy, and also there are many, many like not superficial opportunities for us to take what's good from that, learn from the mistakes, and do much better in the coming centuries here. And we have like an amazing starting place to begin from because we have a lot less degradation than a lot of other places. Um, Another thing that was a point of caution was just seeing, patterns of rural depopulation and sort of a very wide range of changes in the intergenerational relationships with these trees and with the food systems that emerge from these trees. So, like on the left, you see us with the family that runs Fenoglio Alberto in Piemonte also, and this is like a third generation woman owned, like very impressive business that has like a kind of country store, but also operates like a pretty big medium chestnut processing facility that's doing mostly flour and other value-added products. So they do like a bunch of different chestnut flour pasta and biscuits and cookies and different stuff like that, as well as like a couple of different more like single ingredient dried chestnut products. So this is a case where like the third generation is really engaged and involved in the business and taking over the business. We also saw other places where it was sort of the opposite story. This was a place in Pistoia where it kind of seemed like each successive generation was less interested in this tradition. Um, and we heard from some people that like maybe like the urbanization trend in Italy might be like a generation behind what we see in the States, where here, there's a bunch of people like the people on this call who maybe are like our parents lived in the city, or like a bunch of our peers think that it's great to live in the city, but there's a movement of people who actually want to go back to the country and build, like more resilient land relationships. I think like there's some of that there, but they're mostly still at the point where like uh this woman who's standing to my right, like basically like is just dreaming of getting out of here, and we're all there looking at it like, it's a dream come true. So I think that's like something that we need to take to heart and remember that if we want to build agricultural systems around long-lived perennial plants, like a very important part of that task is figuring out how to build organizations that can do intergenerational succession and do intergenerational stewardship, and continue to create opportunity for new people and younger people.
Well, can I
Um,
chime in on something there?
yeah, definitely, definitely.
I think just an interesting dynamic that came out of kind of the first point Noah was making around like the low diversity of these forests, which like for those of you who have never been to Southern Europe, is quite stark. Like you oftentimes are in the forest and don't see any squirrels or any birds, or it's really like there are just trees standing in soil. um, and that's because it's been hunted for millennia to the point of extinction for many of those species. Um, but I think one of the other things that I felt being there, and I had been in similar areas of France years ago, but being there and thinking about how much like when Bread Tree was starting, it seemed crazy to talk in 30-year terms. And I'm very thankful that Brad and Elizabeth wanted to sign a 30-year lease to start Bread Tree. And I think one of the things that Noah asked me about when we were walking in the woods is like, how much longer should we be thinking than 30 years? Or if we think beyond like 30 years in these systems that we're designing right now, might be more appropriately understood as the establishment phase. And what is our thinning regime in these orchards such that we're maintaining more sun to the understory and actually maintaining the feed value of our silvopastoral system and not just using animal-based systems as a way to establish monocrop chestnut orchards, but really kind of thinking in century or multi-century timescales and in the mosaic patterns that we know northeastern landscapes were managed in pre-Columbian times, where oftentimes what was a forest might only be a forest for 50 years or 20 years even before it was cycled into a next kind of typology of management or the next structure of that forest life. And to me, that's actually like a quite inspiring idea, that to think that we don't have to stop at what's the term by which these systems become profitable, but what is kind of this ongoing cycle that we're hoping to all create. And I thought one of the really interesting things that I got from meeting a few different folks of our generation there is, in some ways, our experience with some of the folks in the older generation was like they were just trying to keep it going. Whereas Marco Bozzolo, who's our generation, he's done like really aggressive pruning work and thinning work in a way that was making his truly a mountainside that he was managing be kind of the most vibrant and the most kind of alive of the chestnut orchards we got to visit, despite also having 500 or 700-year-old trees. And it was an interesting, to me, it was really interesting to see. It was like the place where that generation committing to that place actually was sparking something new. Whereas I think in a lot of these places, there's been a century of folks just kind of trying to hold on to that legacy and just trying to keep the trees alive with a lot of introduced fungal blight, like what we experienced here, and insect pests. They just kind of wanted it to stay alive. And it was really beautiful to see Marco bringing this like this new cycle of life and management to those orchards. And it's a lot of inspiration for, I think, us to not just think about making profitable chestnut systems, but really contributing to a cyclical mosaic management system here in the region.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing which I didn't have in the notes, but this is just like I don't know, really, I think an important cultural observation that I came away with is like I've traveled a fair amount in Italy earlier in my life, kind of for like coincidental reasons, just because I learned to speak Italian for coincidental reasons and then wanted to keep practicing. But I think when I was younger, I had like a much more like rose-tinted glasses perspective on what I saw there. And this time I was able to really come home and like appreciate a lot of what they do, but also really appreciate certain gifts that we have as people in the United States. Like we're very free of convention. We're relatively free of convention. And we be in the same breath that like we didn't inherit these really good solutions to a lot of life's problems. Like people there have like inherited these like in many cases really wise solutions that have been refined over hundreds of years and many consecutive generations of like careful observation. They're also really resistant to trying new things in ways where we can just like invent whole new agricultures. So that I think that's something this inspired me to really like want to uh, embrace and see as like kind of our strength culturally. Um, Okay, so we just have some photos here from some of the processing facilities. Just, giving you a sense of scale. I think, Russell, do you think each of these were like maybe 1,000 pounds each bin, would you guess? Yeah, you're muted.
I'm muted. I think closer to a ton per bin.
Oh, okay. It's
So
like 1,000 kilo. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, and a lot of these facilities, it's like this is a tiny percentage of what you see just on a given day that you're in there. Um, these are a couple of examples of giving you a sense of like the scale of equipment at some of the larger facilities. This is a sterilizer on the left with us up on a catwalk. Um, the guy who's standing up on top is like the lead engineer of this firm, Nunziata, that built this facility. Um, yes, as Russell just typed in the chat, that chamber is processing 9,000 pounds per hour. And this is one of the auger systems. That's a side view. So that's like one of the waste that green bin is collecting floaters basically from that progression. This is another Nunziata system, sterilization system at a facility outside, like in Viterbo region outside of Rome. Um, and you know, just wanted to share this stuff like so you have some kind of sense of the scale that we're seeing there. This is like a way bigger scale, just to be clear, than when Russell's saying, the facility we're talking about building is maybe 10 times bigger than the biggest place in the United States. This is a scale that's like a lot bigger than, if we're talking about maybe 1 million pounds to 2 million pounds of annual throughput, these facilities are doing like 4 to 20 million pounds of annual throughput. So like this is a sizing progression that is sorting chestnuts into 13 different size groups by millimeter. So that 26, 27, 28, those are millimeters. Uh, each of those receiving hoppers is on a recessed scale. So they have a whole computer system that can tell them exactly how much weight is in each of those. And they're using that because they use uh, a system that we're not planning to use called brulage, which is basically like we might have time to show you some pictures. It's basically like a bunch of belted flamethrowers that use flames to remove the shells, to char the shells off of chestnuts, which is usually before like making marron glacé or like steamed peeled, bagged chestnuts, or those sorts of like wet products is what we would generally call them, which are becoming a more popular thing for processors in Italy to produce, although it's like a relatively recent phenomenon. But there's not really a reason if you're not using a machine that needs to be calibrated, to the millimeter that you would calibrate to the millimeter. So we're probably not, we're probably planning to calibrate like small, medium, large, extra large. Um, this is uh, Vittorio, Gennaro, and Bug having a little bilingual shouting match. I think what we were hoping to illustrate here is just that's extremely loud. That was something that was really surprising to me. Like several phases of the processing are really, really like cacophonously loud. Um, so that has some implications for facility design that I definitely wasn't thinking about before we went there.
I
Um,
think I think actually also specifically in this picture, Bug is looking at chestnuts. At the first site we went to, one of our first takeaways was we were looking at nuts that had gone through a full process. And there's a story that a lot of folks in the US tell that's like we get the worst quality nuts from Europe. And so everything that's in the grocery store is really low quality, and what we produce in the region is better. And I would say our experience from being in Italy is that it is true that what we can produce fresh here in the Northeast is better, but it's not actually because they're sending us the low quality. There's a really interesting thing to understand about Italian chestnut production, which is that most of the production is really from hobbyists. So it's the kind of folks who have 500-year-old orchards in their backyard and go out once or twice a fall to harvest. And they're kind of, to some extent, just harvesting what's on the ground and then bringing it to the local or regional processing facility. And then that goes to market. I wouldn't say in the professional sense they're truly chestnut farmers. They are stewarding chestnut groves, but what we experience is what that does mean is that even some of the nuts making it through quite rigorous quality testing still come out the other end and oftentimes have what wouldn't make it through our quality testing here in the US in terms of like weevil holes or some of them even just were like the way in which they'd been processed made them like the texture was a little off or they hadn't cured long enough so they weren't quite as sweet. And I think also the European chestnuts are just not as sweet as the Castanea mollissima that many of us are growing. So if I recall correctly, I think the face bug is making is that she's just tried a European chestnut that's gone through a processing line and maybe was a little disappointed.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I was specifically trying to ask them because the millers have a suspicion that the hot water bath leaches tannins into the nut and that you need time for the nut to rest. And I was trying to ask them if they've noticed anything about tannins leaching into the nut from their hot water line. And one, it was so hard to say in Italian, and then they were just like, no, absolutely not. Like they're just very vociferous about the quality of their nuts. But I had just tasted a nut that had gone through the processing line and it tasted tannic to me. So I was just trying to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah. I think overall we came away like feeling very confident that we in the States could build an industry with way higher quality standards than the industry in Italy. Um, uh, the picture on the right is from Chianchia, which makes some like harvester kind of small to like big farm scale to small industrial scale harvesting and processing equipment for hazelnuts and chestnuts. Um, this image on the right is from their facility as well. Um, and I think what we wanted to talk about here was basically the observation that, I think this is probably you guys are familiar with this, but like there's a fundamental question when you're designing processing facilities and processing flows about whether you're using a batch-based system like bins that are being dumped bin by bin into a processing, an individual process, or like what's happening at Route 9, where like an individual bin is being dunked into the hot water jacuzzi, versus more of a continuous system, which is what almost universally is preferred as you get into larger scales, where each phase of the process is actually automatically feeding the next phase, which allows for a much higher throughput with a lot less like human operating, a lot less forklifting and a lot less of the associated attendant risk that comes with that. Um, but one thing that we came away definitely seeing is like the value of that more continuous design in the abstract might be limited in the context of the scale that we're actually targeting, because even in a world where we're processing, 1 million pounds a year, if you actually do the math on how much throughput that is every day, and you take into account the fact that it might be aggregated from many different farms, and there's going to be a lot of like inconsistency and kind of like clumpiness in the flow. Um, in any given moment, you might really not be getting that much additional value or benefit from the much more expensive kinds of continuous systems. Russell, was there anything else that you wanted to say on that note?
I think it might just be helpful to talk people through what they're seeing here. Um,
Oh yeah.
just as an example. So I'm going to just annotate with my cursor so it's a little easier to see. So this is actually a giant pit. And what's happening is a truck is going to back up to here, likely a dump truck, and it's just going to dump. This is actually a hazelnut facility. FACMA, the equipment manufacturer, owns, I want to say like 500 hectares of hazelnut production. And so hazelnuts will be dumped over this grate. Some of the larger refuse will be filtered out by the grill. And then I'm not going to get this perfectly right, but then there's actually kind of a conveyor system or like a ladder system that's automatically pulling nuts up here, dropping them down, This is then aspirating out dust and leaves and dirt in this barrel. And then I think they're actually flowing somehow down here. And this is a swilling tank. So there's actually like an auger going through here. And a swilling tank, what it does in a lot of these nut processing steps or lines, you use whether something floats or is dense enough to sink as a grading step. And so in a swilling tank, anything that floats is being cycled off and going to your compost. And then anything that sinks is dense enough that it's food grade, and then it's feeding up this ladder. All of this is automated, and that is feeding into here. So this is the inside of that building, and this is a conveyor belt that's then feeding nuts to these different silo dryers, which they sit in for like 2 to 3 days, depending on their moisture levels. And then as they reach a sufficient moisture level to be dry, they then are automatically dropped out onto a conveyor out of these silos that then flows them into kind of a holding unit for dried hazels before they go elsewhere, either for shipment or. And so that whole process, all of those steps could be individual machines, as Noah was saying, that a forklift is driving those 1 ton totes to, but it ends up requiring a lot of forklift operation. It ultimately takes up a lot of space because forklift alleyways are kind of quite space inefficient. It's empty space that has to be kept open so that forklifts can navigate them. But also, this is quite a bit more expensive and requires really knowing exactly what solution you want, which, given that we've never done this before, no one in the US has ever done it before for this specific crop, we have some concern with buying solutions that are going to be fixed solutions that in 2 years, when we decide we don't like the design we came up with, we can't really go backwards on. Versus you can buy all of this equipment on wheels.
Yeah. Thank you, Russell. That's very helpful. Another note on this is that if you look closely on the left side of the left picture, right where you see the ladder, behind that ladder is a conveyor belt that's conveying all of the hulls and other biomass from this process, from the hazelnut intake over the edge where you see that kind of crenellated edge of that wall. Just over that wall is like a massive kind of like a bunker silo like you see with corn silage in the States, full of hazelnut husks. And that's one of the reasons why this is sited out, in a covered overhang outside the building. This is something that we see really commonly as a pattern, that there are important functional reasons why certain phases need to happen inside versus outside under cover versus, inside in a very specifically isolated set of conditions. And those all have to do with, different like functional needs of those processes. Russell, is there a way to clear the annotation?
Also, Noah, is there a picture of the man who invented all of those machines? I wish we could add it for
We
everybody.
we don't have it in the slides, but maybe let's bring up the Google Photos after we get to the slides and we can show.
An important note that we discovered is at every facility, every piece of equipment we were seeing had been invented by that company, and we were promised we would never see it again. Which turned out to be proven wrong at the subsequent facility we would go to, where they had very similar solutions.
Machines, yeah.
But that guy did actually invent some stuff.
Yeah. So this is a photo from Ostra Grigori, which I think has there's a lot of valuable information in this photo. So I encourage you to look closely. What you're seeing here is a sizer. The blue on a Trini machine in the middle is a sizer. So you see like the intake of that sizer is set up with a gravity bin. Each of these bins that has that kind of like inverted pyramid bottom is what we would call like a gravity bin. There's a gate at the bottom of that inverted pyramid. And what that allows you to do is, fork that toad into place. You can even fork multiple on top of each other. And then whenever you want to open the gate, you open the gate. And, you could open the gate on 3 in a tower and have them flow through. Like it kind of has a crude plumbing to it as an alternative. So like in most cases, they're avoiding actually tipping bins over, um, because it's a lot more efficient this way and a lot safer. Um,
N-
and
No,
then
I
so
think
that's
that, go ahead, sorry.
go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, I think one of the things we wanted to also highlight in this image was, I think a big takeaway for us was really, um, it's so important in doing these visits to understand the context in which each decision is being made. And so, for example, the giant tanks, stainless steel tanks in the background here, that is actually the ancient way of dealing with weevils, was to submerge nuts in water for, depending on who you ask, 7 to 14 days. This is just like ambient temperature water. Um, and you're basically the lack of oxygen in that environment is preventing the weevils from hatching somehow. Um, but this facility is moving 15 million pounds a year. To have enough tanks for a process that takes 1 to 2 weeks would probably fill the whole facility. And so at some point, despite this being quite energy efficient, because you're just filling them with cold water, releasing the cold water, and then releasing the nuts, I think you're filling every 1 or 2 days with cold water or something like that. So it's not heating up water, and you don't have as many moving parts. So it's quite efficient in one way. They have now invested in a sterilization line, like what we were showing earlier. This is just around the corner, which was probably a $400,000 to $500,000 investment. But that sterilization line, I would guess, in about 3 hours, is moving as much chestnuts as is moving through those tanks in 2 weeks. And so it just totally changes the flow of that facility, that they can use this sterilization line as a weevil treatment and a fungal treatment instead of the kind of static tanks. That said, there's definitely a use case here in the US for something like those tanks, where you kind of figure out what your max throughput is going to be for a year, you get your harvest done, and you are gradually, for example, filling a single tank, and that's your whole weevil treatment. I could see that actually working for smaller scale producers. Um, Similarly, I think on the next slide, Noah, there's a total level up from kind of quality control and treatment, which one of the ways we actually heard people were dealing with weevils is not dealing with them at all. So by the time they're receiving a lot of the nuts, because of how infrequently people are harvesting, the weevils have often actually just already crawled out of them. And so they then set them aside via the swilling tank. So the nuts float in a swilling tank. They have about 20% losses just from that. And they just accept that as an economic loss because of the very affordable rate that they're getting chestnuts from the farmers. But then they can use something like an optical scanner here, which this computer is showing the images of the nuts that are moving on conveyor belts and being siphoned off of the lines in an automated fashion based on what the computer is reading. This unit is, I would say it's like a 40 by 80 foot room, the entire machine. It's running continuously without human control, costs about $1 million. Uh, and it is about 90% as good as the guy told us, the 30 women who he employs who would otherwise be doing manual sorting. He said it a little more bluntly than I am saying it. But even then, he spent $1 million and still has to do manual sorting on the other end because there's still 10% defects coming out. So, for example, for us at our scale, $1 million investment in just a sorting machine will never make sense. There are $30,000 and $100,000 optical sorting machines, to give you a sense. But kind of understanding in each context, are you leaning more on optical sorting, more on manual sorting? Are you just accepting the losses from weevil larvae having crawled out your nuts? Or are you treating with cold water or hot water? These are some of the kind of like context specific questions that we were coming up against.
I also think worth mentioning, Russ, that, and maybe tell me if I'm remembering this wrong, but like the Marones are getting sterilized, but nuts that are too small to even go into this facility that Master Grigori had are just being sent somewhere else, and they're like, great if there's weevils getting ground up in our flour, is sort of the story that we were hearing from some people about not for flower nuts, just not even really doing anything for weevils.
Yeah, I think they are still doing the swilling tank, so they still are like having the 10 to 20% losses of just all the floaters, and they just have a lot more floaters than we do because they're not treating for weevil at all. But I think you're right that they're allowing for more defects or insects than we would in
They're
our
making jokes about more
yeah.
protein and
Yeah.
we didn't actually even get to see this. I think it's worth people understanding to give like to understand the scale of this operation. Like we didn't even get to see the flour processing facility of Master Grigori. We were in like an enormous facility and flour was done elsewhere. Any nuts for flour were just sent on trucks to another facility. Um, and I wanted to say from the beginning, while we're on this subject, that even though Italy has a lot of flour products, actually a lot of these bigger facilities are increasingly shifting into making peeled, bagged nuts, similar to what's happening in China. I just think that's kind of an interesting trend for everyone on this call to hear. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Um, let's see what else we have. I think we're close to the end here. Um, we were going to show a couple of examples of harvesters. So we definitely came away from this trip with a much clearer and fuller understanding of the whole spectrum of harvesting technology that exists and how it corresponds to different use cases in our context. So, that's both that's in terms of, the scale of the orchard, the age of the orchard, the type of ground that the orchard is planted on. Is it relatively even? Is it flat? Is it very steep and irregular? Um, and what are the economics of whoever's harvesting? Like there are sort of like thresholds that justify different kinds of scales of investment. So this is like pretty representative of the smaller end. Like Fakma makes these, Kiankia makes them in different sizes, and a couple Hasatsan in Turkey, a bunch of different firms in Europe make these. This is basically like a PTO powered vacuum harvester that you would pull behind a tractor. Um, you've probably seen, some of you have seen like machines similar to this in the States. You could have one or two hoses off this, and basically, people are on foot carrying hoses and actually vacuuming up nuts. Um, Here we're seeing like representative examples of like the kind of medium and large versions from Fakma. There's like a million different permutations in between. That's very confusing, but the broad categories here are like, you're going from non-self-propelled PTO powered vacuum harvester to, on the left, this is our friend Eric Hagen, who runs the research farm at Savannah Institute, sitting in a self-propelled vacuum harvester. So you see those tubes, basically the arms in the front are sweeping into those tubes, but you need to windrow for this to work. You need to have previously windrowed all of your chestnuts so that you can easily collect them in a line. Um, and it's being stored in a hopper in the back. On the right, this machine that I'm sitting in is one of the biggest models that Fakma makes, which is an actual a self-propelled mechanical harvester. So it's not harvesting with aspiration, it's actually harvesting with mechanical sweeping. So this is like a little more like a combine and has big hopper in the back. Um, we also just wanted to show you, we weren't able to take any photos from this facility, but this is a machine made by a firm in Piemonte called Monchiero. And we were really impressed with their operation, both in terms of like what we saw at their manufacturing facility and also the way that their machines were designed. Generally speaking, I think like the largest harvester that Fakma makes is comparable to the smallest harvester that Monchiero makes. And then Monchiero goes up, considerably from there. Like they have 250 horsepower, massive harvesters that are being used all over the world for macadamia and all kinds of other ground harvested tree crops. One thing we really appreciated about the design of these machines is that there are no bottlenecks. So like you can see the belt in the back here is like the whole width of the machine. I think there's like no, basically they designed the whole thing to make it so the throughput, the physical throughput all the way through the flow is as large as possible to reduce the likelihood of stuff getting jammed. And also just like the sophistication of the manufacturing. This was like, they had like literal robot butlers moving around, autonomous robots moving around with like trays and interacting with a massive like physical database of parts where they could just, automatically plug in what parts they needed. And, it was like the Jetsons in Northern Italy. Um, uh, an important thing to be aware of in terms of the intentions of how you use these mechanical harvesters is they are recommending that you basically run what they call in English a mulcher. That in this case, you're looking at the back of one, or I guess the front if you're front mounting it with a hydraulic swing arm side cutter on it. And this basically is like a flail mower, if you're familiar with the way that a flail mower is designed and functions, but with instead of blades on the rotor, there's like these huge mallet hammers. And the intention of this is twofold. One is to break up any woody debris that's on the ground that's going to interfere with mechanical harvesting. And the second is to kind of like terraform all the micro topography of the ground to make it a little bit smoother. So over time of running these hammers, you're like smooth, you're kind of like putting a Gaussian blur on the topography of the orchard, which makes it more conducive to mechanical harvesting. Um, so, in I'm trying to just think of like some examples. Like this kind of machine or the machine that run on the right is like, 100-acre, not super steep kind of orchard. That would be what you are running. And in a smaller context, you would be like moving down the gradient probably towards something like this. Um,
Yeah, and I think one really helpful thing about the PTO, well, really either of the vacuum options, is those tubes can be, I believe, as long as 50 meters. So for
yeah,
example, we expect that like while we won't be able to run our operation just on vacuum harvesters because we would just need too many of them, we still probably ultimately will invest in a couple of them because some of our sites are so steep that what we'll want to do is like park at the top of a hill or at a terrace within a slope and then run those tubes up and down the slope to be able to safely harvest. So I think, as Noah was saying, there's just a lot of like context specific ways to use these different tools. For what it's worth, there is a Scott Smith is a chestnut grower in Michigan who has invested in a Monkey Arrow machine, speaks really highly of it. He's pretty active on the chestnut growers Facebook group and posts YouTube videos of his Monkey Arrow. They also work very extensively in the Pacific Northwest with hazel growers. They said they're in the US 2 to 3 times a year visiting hazel growers, and they invited any one of us who are interested to come to one of their visits in the Northwest and see their machines at work. Um, FACMA has imported to a lesser extent, but I do know Steve Lucas of Oklahoma Chestnuts is pretty extensively using FACMA equipment for harvesting and processing. So there are
yeah,
examples of these tools in the US that can be seen live. Um, I would want to see them live before investing in any of them. So I don't,
yeah,
it was interesting to see all of them. And this is definitely not a sales pitch. I would encourage you all to find
yeah.
examples of the ones that fit your operation.
And I'm hopeful that one thing, the feasibility study that we will be publishing with Savannah Institute, if this grant continues to function, is supposed to be focused mostly on post-harvest equipment, but I would like at some point to try to translate what we learned from this into some kind of like relatively simple manual that can help you see like if you are operating, this many acres and it's this age, like this would be an option. This would be an option for a harvester that would make sense and just sort of like synthesize all of the available options into something that's a little bit more self-explanatory than we had to kind of piece it together ourselves. Um, I think, Russell, maybe we should just break. This stuff is like getting into some tiny details. I think we could just break and go to Q&A. Um, does that work for
Sure.
you?
Yeah.
Um, One, I guess, let me turn off the screen share. One final thing that I just wanted to share, um, in terms of, are you guys still seeing my screen share or is it done?
We are not. No.
Okay, great. Um, One thing that I came away with that's that's um, seemed like a really important implication from this trip was just recognizing that if we want to be doing organic chestnut agriculture in the States, the kind of urgency and importance of how like really detailing and dialing how we harvest is that much more consequential compared to conventional because in a conventional orchard where you're spraying, airborne insecticides, the moment you think that the nuts are starting to develop, you kind of have multiple lines of defense against weevils, whereas in an organic orchard, um, basically your only line of defense, or your most important line of defense is the hot water bath, which really needs to be implemented like within 24 hours. So that's not just about, ensuring food quality for your customers. It's also about trying to interrupt the life cycle of the weevil and basically get the nuts off the orchard floor before the pupae crawl out and go into the soil. If anybody here is growing chestnuts and hasn't like researched the life cycle of the weevil, I encourage you to, because that's what they want to do is they need to sit on the ground in the orchard for a couple of days so that the pupa can develop, crawl out, go into your soil, and that's how they're going to stay there. Um, so basically, I think in an organic context, it becomes really incumbent upon growers to be harvesting like every day, ideally, like comprehensively harvesting or every 2 days, something like that. Whereas, in a conventional setting, that might be more like every week. But in an organic context, I think you would be seeing your weevil population growing year over year if you weren't harvesting more regularly. So there's a lot that's just sort of like framing a challenge. How we respond to that challenge, I think, is a whole detailed design process. But it's like gonna be a very important thing to figure out. And I think it's figure outable. Russ, do you want to maybe we just go back through the chat and look at all the questions that people have asked, and then if people have live ones, we can go to those.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe can we just give people like 2 minutes to stand up, go to the bathroom, get a drink of
Sure.
water if they want, and maybe in that time, if you have questions you want to add to the chat, it's helpful to see all the questions because they may overlap and
Yeah.
we might be able to combine some. Um, I also think we could offer some space that if there are other folks who have had experience doing similar site visits that want to add any of their observations on equipment, like I know Jono, you've spent some time in Italy and Portugal. If there's anything that folks feel like would be added color to what we've just added, happy to hear about that.
And I just put a Google Doc in the chat and people can put their questions into that and then we'll have them if we don't get to them. How does that sound? Good. Okay.
I'm just gonna stand up and get a drink myself. All right, should we start looking at them?
Hmm.
Bug, did you move everything into the doc? Should we be looking at that
Yeah,
Google Doc?
everything's in the
Okay.
doc.
All right, so Ben asked, um, curious to hear what you all saw as far as the logistics of aggregation. How often did deliveries happen? Were nuts kept in cold storage the entire time? Um, those seem like key questions for understanding a realistic geographic range for aggregation. So we were there a little late in the season, so I think our experience was not totally representative, but I think the answer we got when we asked about that was that it was pretty much continuous. I don't think it was all hours of the night, but throughout the day, throughout growing season. But also a lot of these facilities, because of the scale they're at, they're trying to draw from the biggest region they can. So like the first two of the facilities at least that we visited were pulling from Chile. And so that actually means that their processing season is like 6 months long. So like they start with chestnuts from Chile, and then maybe it's Greece, and then it's Spain and Portugal, and then it's Albania, or it's actually a quite broad and continuous process for them. I don't think that doesn't map the intentions of our business. I don't think any of us ever want to be importing from Chile. Um, but I would say broadly continuous in the growing season is what we would expect. And also, I would say from what we've observed, even within young trees here in the Northeast, even if our trees maybe have a 20-day duration of harvest, our harvest season across our region could be a month long. So, this year, I think I know of trees in Pennsylvania, in like northern Pennsylvania, southern New York, that were dropping as early as September 15th. I would bet there were trees in Vermont that were dropping October 10th still, maybe. Um, in terms of the cold storage question, I'd say it's broadly, yes, they should be in cold storage the whole time. There are some kind of interstitial moments, like if they're coming out of a hot water bath and you're trying to return them to room temperature rather than shocking them as they go in directly into cold storage, they might sit out for a day or two. But I'd say if the minimum time a chestnut is spending on site at the facility is 2 weeks, I'd say the maximum it would be out of cold storage would be like 2 or 3 days of those 2 weeks. And realistically, a nut's probably going to be at the facility and in cold storage for a month or two before leaving the site. Does that make sense, Ben?
It does, yeah. I guess I was also, thinking largely about from a grower's perspective, like how frequently how frequently deliveries would be happening because, if the expectation is that you're delivering nuts every day or every other day that you're harvesting on your property, that's obviously a very different story than if you're bringing nuts, once every 2 weeks or something like that. And then what that would
Yeah.
look like to, store nuts on your farm for 2 weeks and then bring them to you and kind of what the expectations might look like for that.
So I think this is a whole like network design, really, because this is in some ways it's actually less about our needs and more about kind of geographic clusters. So like you in a Connecticut River cluster or like a mid Connecticut River Valley cluster with Jono and the cars, for example. Um, I think there's going to be a really important emergent question as these clusters form, which is what processing capacity does each cluster want to seek from our facility versus develop locally? So Jono and I like riffed on this idea last year, and one version of this would be the Connecticut River Valley has a hub that's processing at Jono's, possibly. He's got some grant funding as well. Um, Doing all fresh nut processing and then is going to market with all larger size nuts and kind of fresh quality nuts, but maybe that all small nuts and nuts that want to go through a drying line and be milled into flour would end up at our facility so that the Connecticut River Valley hub doesn't have to develop that capacity. Not saying that's anyone's promised that or anything, but that would be one version. In that version, the cold storage design would be way more dependent on the Connecticut River Valley cluster to figure something that works out for everyone there and kind of would be agnostic of anything we need. Um, in the network design sense, I think something that we were thinking a lot about while we were in Italy was that because all of our economic circumstance is that we're investing a whole load of capex in trying to get these trees in the ground and putting a lot of time and money into, like, this is all one big capital investment while we wait for revenue. And so we're all very incentivized to get 95% of the nuts that fall off the tree, 98% of the nuts that fall off the tree, not settling for 70% or 80%. And so one thing that that's going to mean from a design perspective, like Noah said, is that we're harvesting very frequently and that we have localized hot water bath processing. Because if everyone isn't doing their weevil treatment until 1 million pounds get to Bread Tree's facility, where it's going to drastically reduce the quality of the nuts that we can go to market with, and it's going to reduce what we can pay people for their nuts. So I would guess that any kind of like anyone that's more than an hour away from our facility will actually be quite incentivized to do basically everything it takes to go to market with a fresh nut, or at least do the weevil bath and then bring weevil treated nuts after being cold stored to Bread Tree's facility to be sized and graded. So one thing we've talked about including in the feasibility study is kind of some of our research on like multiple scales of weevil treatment or a fresh nut processing, and what does a facility that requires a few $1,000s look like versus a facility that requires $50,000 versus a facility that's a $2 million facility look like, and kind of how do those all fit together to serve a region? Is
There's
that
also maybe worth I'm just thinking about this right now that in lots of newer orchards, as they're coming into production, you don't actually have weevil yet. So there might actually be, and that might really change as more and more acres get planted. But I'm just thinking right now about if, as you're coming into production, if you don't actually have weevil, then it's possible you could actually just cold store your nuts and do one delivery. And then, like, as you're getting into the next, like, bigger years of production, it can justify having like a dunk tank on site or something like that. Just
Yeah.
thinking about that.
It's conceivable, depending on how this whole thing goes, that like, you know, the hub, this could become like a hub and spoke model where like the hub, whatever is the entity that is running the hub, kind of like comes up with like a kit of smaller gear for the spokes and can kind of like advance the cost of if it was desired, could like advance the costs of that kit of like what's the what's the small the appropriately scaled hot water solution that could then be paid off against future chestnuts or something like that. Like there's a lot of ways that that could emerge to try to create um, to lower barriers to entry for producers working at different scales and like try to catalyze new clusters forming, new kind of spoke clusters forming, like Russell's talking about. But a lot of that is like going to emerge, I don't know, in these kinds of conversations where we hear from people about what they want, how they want it to work.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. And sorry, not to one more quick thing, not to sidetrack the conversation too far, but do y'all know do chestnut weevils progress in cold storage? Is that something that came up? Because like I know, for example, spotted wing Drosophila, my understanding is like in fruit, once it gets into cold storage, that sort of halts its development. Do you have any sense of whether that's the case for chestnuts?
I don't believe that that's the case for chestnut weevils.
I don't know for sure. Um, Anson asked, interested to know if the hot water bath affects the shelf life of chestnuts. Bug or Noah, do one of you want to take that one?
Um, I will start, and Bug, if you have anything you want to add, go ahead. So the most like detailed information that we got on hot water bath was from Greg Miller because we were communicating in both of our first languages. He says basically 119 to 122 degrees Fahrenheit is the range. If you're under 119, you are not killing the weevil or with high enough confidence. If you're above 122, you are starting to cook the nut, which does affect quality and shelf life. As long as you are in that, as long as you stay in that range and you don't overcook, sort of like overdo it into cooking, um, our experience is that the shelf life is not negatively affected. I don't know if I can factually say undiminished, but like not meaningfully diminished. Like we have nuts that we hot water bath, but I think we actually overdid it a little bit. Probably they were very briefly exposed to temperatures higher than 122, and they are in our cold storage from last fall, and they're totally great. Um, so I don't think that there's really good evidence to suggest that if properly implemented, that there's any impact on shelf life. There is this important step that we've talked about, which is like the curing. Um, like the millers just like after they hot water bath, there needs to be like a recovery time because some of the sugars get somehow changed, and you have to give the nuts some days at ambient temperatures to recover. So that obviously like interacts with quality. Like if you put them straight from the hot water bath into cold storage, they would need to cure more before you ate them for them to taste the best. But I don't think that it's affecting shelf life per se. Bug, is there anything that you want to add to that?
I don't think so. I think even if it is affecting shelf life, we kind of have to do it if there's weevil. So it's
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Uh,
the other thing. It's like the abstract world where the shelf life is longer is not a world that you get to live in because you can't leave the weevils in your nuts.
I think
we
something that
also, oh, go ahead. Um, we visited facilities that are storing nuts that are going through a 40-minute, effectively a 40-minute dunk tank in a sterilization chamber and storing those nuts successfully for 6 months, and selling them as fresh nuts. So I think there's enough evidence to say that it is quite shelf stable as long as you have good quality cold storage protocols.
After the fact, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it's worth sharing it. It's not even necessarily what we would want to be aiming for in our industry, but a big takeaway from Italy that Russell kind of touched on was like after our first year of processing our nuts and like I was so like yeah, like probably inspecting every single nut that we shipped to customers this year. I it like the quality in Italy, like just like seeing the quality control and like just actually like the quality of a lot of nuts that were going out was kind of just like felt very relaxing. Like you're like, oh wow, like because
That's
it's
a good
felt
way to
like
put
fresh
it.
nuts are so fragile and intense, and it's like what makes me more excited about flour because it's just like way easier to handle all of those nuts. There's so much scary about fresh nuts. You got to keep them moist and alive and just like
Yeah, not too
basically
dry, not
pamper
too
them
wet.
so much. But in Italy, it just kind of left me going like, ah, okay, like we've been like really anxious, like parents of a baby, like we can just relax a little. Yeah.
Yeah. But also it's like you can relax as you get your protocols really dialed and
Yeah.
you really
Yeah.
understand what the boundaries are because actually it's pretty easy to mess up and we've like messed it up a bunch of different ways and are still figuring it out.
Yeah.
Um,
And Hannah asked, are those chestnut varieties the same, flour and fresh? I think there would be less water for nuts, and I would think there would be less water for nuts intended for flour, but perhaps it's negligible. Um, it is basically there's two answers. So in the European context, there are more kind of like they might call them like wild type chestnuts that are gonna only go for flour, and they have very specific qualities that are more valued for their fresh nuts and for their roasting carts. Um, and they kind of almost have like a classification that I guess would be called like a subspecies, where they're calling in some places in Italy it's like a Maroni versus Castagna or Castagno. What do they call the other one? Castagna?
Tanya.
Castagna
Yeah.
Yeah.
with an A, yeah.
Uh,
They call it type.
um,
Call it
but
type.
then there are cultivars within the Castagna types that are more flower cultivars. It seems like they're a little like lesser appreciated and somewhat forgotten and only understood by like specific people. And then I think there is evidence that within the genetics that are grown in the US that there are trees that have traits that we should be selecting for as flower trees that are kind of broadly speaking like more productive trees, but producing smaller nuts and maybe nuts that dry out faster. But that many of the growers in the US who have been selecting genetics in the eastern US for chestnut production have favored the traits that are more for fresh production. So nut size and moisture retention. And there's actually a whole project that needs to be undertaken where we do the same kind of selection and progeny testing, but with a lens towards flower production. And it's something we're working on. We have a block in our land that we've intended to plant out as a flower orchard where we're specifically selecting for those traits. For a variety of reasons, it's going to end up being one of the last blocks to get planted. But I think it is a relevant set of selection traits. It's almost like a type of chestnut, a type of hybrid chestnut that we would work our way towards through breeding, would be a flower nut.
But I think it is important to just to clarify the boundaries of the possibility there. Like, it is not likely that any of those breeding efforts would result in a chestnut that was like less than half water. So in terms of just like the basics of that question, I think it's possible that you could get to drier chestnuts, but chestnuts have a lot of water in them, period. And you're not gonna get it to be like a 10% water fruit.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I'm asking is, and when I hear like the variety of aggregation opportunities and collecting from, your backyard growers or whatever it might be,
Yeah.
is it worth making a distinction or like setting that precedent for flower oriented chestnut versus fresh eating? And like, where are we within that? Where, in the US, people understand that there is a distinction amongst those two intentions behind chestnuts.
You're saying making that distinction?
The growers or people who plan on accessing the market, because it seems like if one is investing a bunch of time, energy, and equipment behind flower production for a nut that isn't optimal for flower production, like wouldn't growers kind of want to know that like that, or am I like behind the ball and people
No,
are
I think in theory, what you're saying, it totally makes sense in theory. I think it's important to just understand that like there are many opportunities. This is my understanding right now. There are many opportunities to develop a population that would be even better for flower production. Today, the populations that exist for fresh consumption are also great for flower production. It's just that the economics of flower production are less preferable for most growers. And so basically the logic that I mean, first of all, like there are very few operations in the whole country who even could be thinking about making flour. It's like Route 9 and the Michigan Co-op and I don't know, maybe a couple of other people, but like there's probably fewer than 10, I mean, there might be fewer than 5 operations in the whole country who even like could be thinking about it. But I think the logics that are being used within those contexts are like nuts that are too small to be saleable as fresh nuts go to flour. So it's a waste stream anyway, and nuts that fail some grading step but are deemed, so like aesthetic, superficially blemished, but of sufficient quality to still be edible, go into the flour stream. So it's like it's sort of like making a value added product out of what would otherwise be a waste stream right now. I don't think there's anyone in the country, maybe I'm mistaken, maybe Michigan Co-op is placing more emphasis on it than I'm aware of, but as far as I know, there's no chestnut growers or processors in the country who like see flour as a primary, that they're all seeing it as like a kind of way to make, a value added product out of what would otherwise be a waste stream. I think, yeah, it's going to be, we'll have to see how that goes. We just see that from a market development perspective, like there's so much interest in flour. There's so much versatility of its use. And if all of our goal is to make chestnut an actual staple grain, it's just a lot easier. To me, it seems a lot easier to envision how that actually happens when it's a shelf-stable flour or whole grain compared to being a seasonal, like pretty uh, fussy to store seasonal starch.
Um, I just want to briefly share because it's just so beautiful that the only people that really care about like really I mean people really care about the Marrone cultivars in Italy. Like that's Marrone is like what they're just all obsessed with. They actually like really disparage Chinese nuts when you talk to them about the kinds of cultivars we're growing. Um, but
Despite
I
the fact that nothing that we tasted anywhere on this trip was like even close to as good as the nuts that all of us grow. Like not even close.
Well, it's just really beautiful to get to visit some of the like Marco Bozzolo, some of the sort of like more historic family-run orchards where they're very attentive to the cultivars they have there that have been grown in that place for this specific use of chestnuts for hundreds and hundreds of generations. And it was like in those like we did get to experience like I went to a water-powered stone mill in the Garfagnana Valley that exclusively mills dried chestnuts, dried chickpeas, and dried corn from people growing specific cultivars of those things like in that region. And it was very beautiful to see. But some of the like the bigger processing facilities that we went to, I don't think like there's any distinction being made about like what's flour. It's basically just like mush, or it's just like, yeah, all cull and small nuts, like all together with weevils and other stuff in there.
Yeah, it's like more of an industrial logic than it is about, provenance or any specific characteristics of certain sources.
I think for us as a business, there's also a really big question that we're kind of dealing with, which is like how much do we prioritize price per pound and how much do we prioritize building a market that could sustain 100,000 acres of chestnuts planted? Not because our business will plant 100,000 acres, but I think we're a little skeptical about like if everyone who plants chestnuts today just pushes fresh chestnuts at the highest price per pound, I think we're setting up the next generation to have a much harder time increasing adoption of chestnut agroforestry because at some point we're going to hit a threshold where there aren't actually that many Americans who want to buy fresh chestnuts and cook fresh chestnuts. And having developed how we go to market with flour products or chestnut flour pastas or any of these different products is really going to be the thing that catalyzes a much larger version of this agriculture, whether that's in 5 years or 50 years. So I think all of us on our team feel a certain level of responsibility to like investing in that future, not just selling every pound we can for the highest possible price. But that's
Um,
not to say everyone should take that approach.
okay, Vaughn asked any thought of canned chestnut cream puree, such as this. Yeah, it's very popular in France.
Yeah.
There's different versions. There's like marron glacé. There's sweeter versions, and there's more like what we might call like a chestnut butter. That's like not quite as candied. Um, I think like a non-candied chestnut butter of some kind could be something that we would be interested in doing at some point. Um, I think broadly our focus has been on the way we think about it is like this is like speaking about bread tree, just us. I think if other people want to do it, it's great. It's like we want to focus more on dinner than dessert, if that makes sense. Um, but I think there's definitely a place for it. Like I've made chestnut puree that was really good. Um, I think a lot of the stuff they do in France is like it's like way too sweet for my taste. And like I think chestnuts are sweet enough on their own. Like I kind of want to breed chestnuts that are less sweet, but like for flour. But I definitely think there's a role for it. It's just not something that's like the top of our priority list right now.
Liang asked, what's the breakdown of reasons and uses for the 20% of nuts that are not suitable for fresh nut sales? I think the biggest one is probably too small. So right now in the US, the most common grading system I've seen is anything that can fall through a three-quarter inch circle doesn't go to fresh market. I think smalls are between 3/4 of an inch and 7/8 of an inch. Um, and then it goes up from there. So I think that's probably the biggest cull that we saw. Then there's any damage that causes the nuts to float is kind of what filters them out of our system in how we're processing right now. So that could be a weevil tunnel, but that could also be like nuts that are harvested early. So when the nut's still white is something we observed this year. It was more likely to float in our processing. I think otherwise nuts that aren't fully formed, like often when you harvest a chestnut, there are some that are almost look more like the raisin version of a chestnut, like a little wrinkly, and those will float. But then also in visual inspection, so mold or brown rot or other insect damage or cracked shells that just got damaged mechanically. I think 20% is high from what we've seen. I think even in kind of like a lot of mistakes and learning this year, we were more like 10 to 15% total. So I'd be pretty disappointed if 20% became our norm. But in a context in Italy where some people are only harvesting once or twice a season, so nuts are on the ground for a week at a time, it seems quite reasonable to expect 20% losses.
Yeah.
But again,
And
they didn't pay to plant those trees or buy the land. So the
yeah,
economics of their operation is a lot easier.
that's super different. I think another big area of learning opportunity for us in this region, and I think in this community of practitioners is like there really aren't that many examples of mature chestnut operations that, in my view, have like exhausted the potential of organic management in terms of soil health or biodiversity of other plant and animal and fungal and bacterial species in the orchard context. And I don't say that in any way as a criticism of anyone's operation. It's just that isn't like the way that the few people who are doing chestnuts at any kind of like bigger scale are doing agriculture in the States, and that's okay. Um, but I do think that in terms of quality, like we really don't know what is achievable with like really comprehensive remineral, like really good remineralization or really good fungal inoculation or really diverse herbaceous layers, really good silvopasture integration. Like a lot of the things that actually make this agroforestry, like really nobody's figured out in the States. And that's both like a little daunting because it's just a lot of work to do, but also I think there's a huge potential in terms of uh, achieving, improving those kind of loss assumptions. You know, like when we look at like I don't know if any of you all are familiar with Helen Athau's work. She wrote a book, the name of which I always forget. It's like The Ecological Farm or something like impossible to remember like that. And they are peach and they're fruit growers in the Pacific Northwest who use like mineral sprays and a lot of like very nuanced green mulching techniques for like true integrated pest management, organic integrated pest management. And I think they've like got their crop loss below 10% with totally organic management. So you know, it's like this is organic orcharding is actually not a world. I wouldn't have guessed this before I got into this work. It's really not a world where there's like a comprehensively worked out set of best practices. It's a world where actually we're like we're like just barely starting to figure it out. So anyway, this is just to say like the sky's the limit. Jono asked, do we see peeler machines at the medium scale besides that burning off the shell? So yeah, what peeler you use, what we learned is basically what peeler you want to use varies depending on your intended utilization or end product. So like they use the brulage in cases where they want a cooked peeled end product. If you want a dried peeled end product, you would use a different type of peeler. There are some wet peeled end products where they use steam peeling. Like I think a lot of the stuff that they do in France, the creme de marron and the marron glacé and stuff, they use steam peelers. Um, but for dried peeling, the whole process is different. So if you want, you know, for flour, like the way that there are a couple different mechanisms that are commonly used in Italy for peeling dried nuts to make dried whole kernels or flour or fragments or different products. But all of them involve drying the nut before you shell it, because obviously it's a lot easier to shell it once you have already dried it, because the kernel shrinks away from the pellicle. Um, so those systems are kind of just like light grinding, like it doesn't take, you can take dried chestnuts and like shake them around in a 5-gallon bucket and most of the shells come off. So we're actually working right now, Jono, we're trying to find exactly a great, like something, a peeler that for dried output that we're like really happy with, but there is one. Monquero makes one that's great, and the only downside of it is that it's PTO powered, which is kind of like it's not a downside, it's just like has pros and cons. So like that's useful in Italy because the tradition is that people are like aggregating from forests in all of these remote kind of regional co-ops, and then maybe someone would just bring that PTO powered machine and run it off of somebody's old tractor, for a day of the year or something, and then move it around to the next valley or whatever. In the context of like a more stationary processing facility, having it run on a PTO is like possible, but kind of annoying and like dirty and noisy compared to just having an electric motor. Um, there's a firm in Piemonte who does a really good electric one that has like multiple, it'll output shells over here, whole kernels over here, and fragmented kernels over here. But like the guy's sick and old, and we can't get him to export. So I think there's a little bit more research to be done there. But like there are totally viable options. I think like the perfect option for our context still eluding us.
Cool.
John, I
Thank you.
actually
That's good to hear.
I just forwarded you two emails I sent to Jonathan Carr, who was asking the same question earlier today. I don't know if
Okay.
he's asking for the same reason that you're asking, but
Yeah.
with the two that Noah just referenced. I think we are going to run out of time and not be able to answer all the calls here, or all the questions here. I think what we'll do is we'll take the questions that were asked and unanswered and bring them into the next call on March 25th, when we're planning to get a bit more detailed. What we're thinking for that call is that we'll kind of go equipment company by, we'll go through all the equipment companies we visited, and give a sense of, Brennan, if you actually just send me a quick email, I see your comment, I'll send you the links. We're going to go company by company and give you a sense of what our understanding was walking away from having visited those facilities and what niche those companies might fill. Some of them, frankly, are way more expensive than I think anyone in the US needs to be going after right now. And then we'll also do some case studies on a couple of the processing facilities we visited and what we saw on the ground in those facilities specifically, and have an opportunity to answer more questions. I think the last thing that we're probably going to get into in that call, but it's also relevant to this Scheller question that's coming up, and it seems like there's quite a bit of interest in based on the chat, is that I think a big takeaway for us was overall, none of this equipment is all that complicated or all that new to food processing. We're just specifically looking for a version of that equipment that fits chestnut processing in the US. Almost all of this equipment in one form or another exists for other crops, whether it's tree crops or other dried bean crops in the US. And so before the federal funding pause was coming down, one of the pieces of research we were really getting into was fielding conversations with domestic fabricators and trying to find fabrication partners who would want to kind of be at the leading edge of chestnut processing here in the US. And given the state of tariffs, not only on countries, but also on steel and aluminum, I think there's even more reason today to find domestic fabricators who can be a solution for the US chestnut industry. So if anyone has any leads on fabricators who might want to be a partner on this project, we'd love to hear about that. And you can email us at russell@redtreefarms.com. And other than that, feel free to be in touch over the next 2 weeks if there's anything you'd like to see out of the next call, and thanks for joining.
Yeah, can I just specifically say, don't feel free, like, please email us if there's like things that you're thinking about that you really want to make sure we get into, or questions that occur to you after this. Because we are doing this to be helpful to all of you guys. So, and there's so
Also
much.
there's a few links we wanted to share, right? I'm